Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Kudless from the California College of the Arts in San Francisco, where I also run the design practice MATSIS. So just to introduce kind of the work a little bit, I'll be presenting the work of an advanced studio at CCA that was co-taught by Nathan Lynch and myself. Nathan is the chair of ceramics at CCA. And the work builds on prior research developed within the Digital Craft Lab and the Architectural Ecology Lab at CCA, exploring innovative fabrication and design in relation to design for non-humans. Before we get to the specific studio results, I want to discuss the origins of architecture. The various creation myths of architecture often alternate between early humans either occupying found forms such as caves or constructing a primitive hut. Vitruvius mentions both of these possible origins for architecture, but he also mentions a third, which is often forgotten. Maybe humans first started building by watching more advanced builders, animals. Although we often think of architecture as a human activity, the diversity and sophistication of animal architectures are astounding and are quite possibly the root inspiration for early human architecture. When discussing living architectures, it's essential to understand these other architectures. From wasps' nests to beaver dams, animals have developed highly complex domestic spaces that often surpass the material, environmental, and structural performances of human-built forms. These non-human architects use a variety of materials such as straw and wood. However, many use earthen materials such as soil, mud, and clay to, in their unique way, 3D print their homes. In the spring of 2008, my colleague Nathan and I taught this advanced studio called Wild and Domestic. We use this alternative history of architecture as a starting point and source of inspiration for how we, as human architects, might conceive a different way of designing, building, and occupying domestic forms. The studio focused on the act of extruding earthen materials as the primary building technique to develop modular and parametric bricks as the primary building system. This combination of primitive material with advanced technology served as one of the primary research areas of the studio. In addition to creating domestic spaces for humans, the studio explored how human-built structures could support the dwelling of non-human species, particularly those who have formed commensal relationships with human environments. The human act of building for animals has a long architectural history primarily centered on transactional exchanges between species. From bee apiaries to dovecotes to silkworm cocooneries and dairy barns, humans have been creating structures for non-humans for centuries in order to benefit from these creatures. Food such as honey, eggs, milk, but also raw materials such as silk, and even less tangible exchanges such as heat and companionship. However, urbanization and industrialization have increased the physical and conceptual distances between humans and non-humans. Our cities have created a sort of toxic monoculture of humanity. Furthermore, and similar to what Mitch was saying, the way in which contemporary architecture engages the non-human world could generally be categorized into total rejection, which that image on the upper right I find just incredible, of covering trees with anti-pigeon devices. Reduction, basically sustainability's focus on energy instead of life, let's say, or benevolent separation, or the picturesque within architecture. So the studio looked beyond these and attempted to discover or rediscover other ways of living with the non-human. Returning to the title slide, a photo of the Sylvester rotting sod house of Nebraska in 1886. It's a revealing portrait of a wild and domestic architecture. Of course, it is primarily a portrait of a rural human family and their sod home. Yet it also captures multiple non-human species that were essential for the human family's survival. Some of these species are wild, some domestic, and some in limbo in between, that they form a web of connections that envelop the architecture of the home. In an age when we are finally recognizing the extent of our deep relationships with the environment around us and the microbiome within us, our studio sought a form of solidarity with the non-human. Donna Haraway, paraphrasing Bruno Latour, states that we, quote, "we have never been human," end quote. When 90% of the cells of our body are non-human, it is impossible to build a wall between us and them. We co-evolve, constantly adjusting to each other and forming symbiotic and commensal relationships that are complex to unravel. The studio researched several case studies of how domestic architecture might serve as the medium to reevaluate the politics, cultures, and ecologies of living near and with other species. Students were encouraged to develop radical approaches to the siting, programming, and ecologies of their domestic designs in relation to both human and non-human clients. While I discuss the organization of the studio, I'm going to play a video in a moment that in some ways exemplifies the commensal relationships that we were interested in pursuing in the studio between humans and non-humans. The video shows the nightly ritual of the Fox's swifts entering into an abandoned chimney in Portland, Oregon. Previously, the species nested within tree hollows. However, with forest habitat loss, the species has evolved to take advantage of chimneys. Each evening in September, tens of thousands of swifts, hundreds of humans, and often a few falcons or hawks preying on the swifts converge on the site as the swifts enter their nesting site at dusk. Architecture plays a central role in this trans-species ritual and questions how we might think of animals not as pests or as pets, but as neighbors. The studio was organized into 3 phases. In phase 1, students focused on gaining the intellectual, technical, and material background needed to succeed in the studio. Students learned how to develop generative toolpaths for 3D printing and work with preparing, extruding, and firing clay. In addition, students built a collective archive of non-human building techniques, potential non-human clients, and examples of human-built animal architectures. In phase 2, students chose at least one of these non-human species as their client and developed a modular 3D printed prototype that might help facilitate their dwelling. In phase 3, students developed a series of multi-species domestic structures and envisioned different forms of domesticity that re-engage humans with the messy and complex reality of living together. So just for the lack of time, I'm just going to present 2 of the students' projects. First, I'm going to talk about the student Maya Nadi's project, who focused on studying the Mexican long-tongued bat and its relationship with mezcal and tequila production in the Oaxaca region of Mexico. So blue agave, used in the production of mezcal and tequila, is pollinated by this bat. However, due to the mass farming strategies used in most agave plantations, the plants are harvested prior to blooming, and the farmers rely on cloning rather than naturally bred plants. This has decreased the genetic diversity of the agave genome while reducing the supply of nectar needed by the bat. In addition, the bat roosts in small crevices in rocks. As humans development has cleared some of the possible roosting locations for the bat, Maya developed a 3D printed ceramic brick that provides the necessary folds and crevices for the bat's domestic space. In addition, by creating openings between the brick courses, pregnant and nursing bats were able to utilize the warm interior of each brick as they require slightly warmer roosting spaces. For her final project, Maya proposed a series of structures that explored how diurnal humans and nocturnal bats might live and work in closer proximity to each other. Her proposal for an eco-resort and sustainable mezcal distillery is aspirational, but it attempts to reconnect humans with the critical labor of non-humans in this craft production. Each student was required to fabricate a 24-inch wide by 40-inch tall ceramic prototype wall. I should note that the prototypes were primarily testing fabrication processes, and no animal testing has yet been conducted, although that will be a focus of future studios. The second project, Nick Tangi's project, focused on the ornate day gecko, a native species found where he grew up on the island of Mauritius in the Indian Ocean. Due to the distance between Mauritius and the mainland of Africa, the ornate day gecko has evolved to be the primary pollinator of the native flora, filling the niche evolutionary niche often occupied by birds or insects. However, in the last 100 years, a much larger gecko from Madagascar has been introduced, which, unfortunately, preys on the ornate day gecko. In Nick's experience of living there, he noticed that the day gecko has adapted to human architecture by hiding in the sashes of sliding doors and windows, which allow it to escape from its larger predator. Nick's ceramic brick design radically multiplies the number of small crevices that the day gecko can hide in by creating a new column typology. These columns consist of a series of open and closed flutes that allow the gecko to lay its eggs and travel throughout the house in safety from its predator. By essentially eliminating the walls of the house and instead creating a field of densely packed columns, Nick greatly increased the habitat of the day gecko while opening up the house to the tropical breeze. In conclusion, the work of the studio attempts to get students to think through the physio and psychological needs of other species in order to decenter humans as the only client or maker of architecture. The studio envisions different forms of domesticity that re-engage humans with the messy and complex reality of living together. I was excited to accept this invitation to speak at the LASG Symposium, as I feel any discussion of architecture a living architecture must address not only the creation of lifelike behavior within architecture, but to actually design and build in a way that supports and encourages the engagement of non-human species, and to resist the monoculture of the human-built environment. Thank you.
Time for a question.
Yes.
I'm fully sympathetic with this idea. I think it's great. So to move on, to carry on, what kind of ideas do you think we could try to prototype in studio around ecosystemic design rather than designing with respect to a relationship between just with one species at a time? To really think in terms of ecologies, whole ecologies.
That actually happened. It wasn't intentional. Originally, part of the assignment was the students had to pick just one species. But once they began to research that species, they began to really understand the ecological network that it was a part of. And some students, I didn't show it here, but for instance, one of the other students was focusing on a type of falcon in the southwest of the United States. And instead of designing specifically for that falcon, he designed for the various mice and rodents that the falcon feeds on. So the house is actually supporting the dwelling of another species. And several students did similar types of things once they got into the deep network of all of these different species.